Hello and welcome to the last session. My name is Dagmar Zwiesnack and I'm going to chair this session. And after we had a lot of HDR presentations, we go now a step back and look a bit into camera workflows. And gentlemen, it's mainly gentlemen, so be honest. Okay, there are some women. We will start with a presentation from Pierre, who entertained you the last couple of hours already. And he will give a presentation about integrating single large sensor cameras into traditional broadcast workflows, opportunities and challenges. And not sure if I need to introduce Pierre again, but I think I give the floor to you and use your time.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, a few of you are still awake. Yay. So for this last time that you will see me today, I'm going to talk about basically something that's happening more and more in our world is the world of cinema and the world of television are merging, and we have less and less of television-specific equipment and motion picture-specific equipment, but things are merging, and one of those areas is cameras. And more we are seeing the integration of camera-type cinema-type cameras and workflows into broadcast television, and I had the opportunity to do some tests with my crew on that, and I'm here just to give you the results and what we found out. So before I dig into the details, the main, if I oversimplify things and keep it at a very high level, we have two types of sensor technologies. Modern day both use complementary metal oxide semiconductors, or CMOS, but one will use three sensors with a prism assembly. That's what we call the three-chip sensor, and the other one is the single large sensor. And they have different underlying principles. So I'll take a couple of minutes just to explain what the difference is before we look at how this affects our image and the kind of problems or challenges that it introduces in our workflows. So this is a basic three-chip assembly that hasn't changed for, oh my God, forever. Basically, this was with charge-coupled devices back in the days. It was three CCD cameras. Now it's three CMOS, but it's the same principle. Light comes in, and the light hits a dichroic prism, which will split it into constituents. The first dichroic prism, which is marked F1, will split blue and yellow light. It will bounce blue light back into one of the sensors, so that sensor will capture light intensity, but the software will know to assign it to the color blue. That's how you get your blue layer. Then the yellow gets split by a second prism into green and red, which hits two other sensors, and that's how you get your red, green, and blue. So it's basically a sensor is a small array of solar panels. It's colorblind. So those prisms tell us which color will hit it so that you can measure the light intensity and assign it to the proper channel. That makes for a rather small assembly. Typically in broadcast, we're talking about 2/3 inch diagonal for the effective size of the sensor. Since, remember I was, I think, customer 4000 on the Red One back in the day. Since those days, single large sensor have really captured the vast majority of digital cinematography. The reason being that since they're pretty large, first of all, you don't have the issues of the prism and of aligning three sensors. It makes for a larger sensor. It's kind of advantageous in cinema because that decreases the magnification factor, which means that you need to zoom in a lot more to have the same framing, which means that you have a shallower depth of field. maybe too much information right now, but basically bigger sensors give you more control over focus, and you can use focus as a storytelling tool. So since our underlying sensor is still colorblind, it only captures light intensity, you have at each photo site a micro color filter. So for each 4 pixels, you have 2 of green, 1 of blue, 1 of red, invented at Kodak. So Kodak, who were in film, actually invented the Bayer pattern, which eventually got them somewhat out of business back in the day. Same principle as the Swiss actually invented the digital watches, which gave them a lot of trouble afterwards. But that's just the way it is. So Mr. Bayer back at Kodak invented the Kodak pattern. The reason he gives 2 pixels of green for 1 of blue and 1 of red is because we have more green cones in our eyes, so we perceive the color green a lot more. So it makes sense to give it more resolution. So that gives you your raw image, what we called a Bayered image, where you don't have a full red, green, and blue, and you now need software to come back and interpolate the missing pixels to give you a full red, green, and blue, what we call the debayering process. So those 2 characteristics, one being a very large sensor and one being a small sensor, means that we have different depths of field for the same framing of a shot. A bit small, but you'll get the idea. So basically what you have here is PCAM, which is a small application for the phone that everybody in the film industry has. It helps us calculate framing, depth of field. You can put in any type of camera that you know on the market. They have actually characterized the sensor, and you have the sensor size and everything else pre-baked into it. You put your exposure settings, the distance, your iris, and it will give you the depth of field. So a very practical tool to calculate depth of field when you're establishing your shots, blocking your action, and things like that. So what you see is that if I use a 2/3 3-chip camera on the right-hand side, for the same framing here, which is about 40 feet from my subject, fairly medium wide, I have something like 140 something feet of depth of field, which is quite a lot. If I give the same framing value, but I use a single large sensor like the, in this case, the Sony FX9, I now have 14 feet of depth of field, so it's a lot narrower. Those characteristics enable us to tell 2 different types of stories. So I just put up an example here I took from YouTube, from the official Academy YouTube channel, where they gave the highlights of the Oscars from earlier this year. You can see this is the kind of use of a single large sensor. We want our nominee to stand out from the rest, so not everything is in focus. You see that the people behind are very blurry while she's very crisp. This is the typical look that you will get from a single large sensor, so it's very practical to isolate your subject. Conversely, in the same show, we had a funny skit, and you want to make sure that you capture the comedian, but also the reaction of everyone. So this kind of depth of field is not appropriate. So for a skit, you want to have deep focus. So in that case, you use a small size sensor where you can really have a deep depth of field, and I can see Cillian Murphy's reaction in the back as he's laughing, and he's not just a big blobby blur. So that's the whole idea. Smaller sensor with 3 chips, larger sensor with a Bayer filter. One is used to give you deep focus, one is used to give you narrow focus. So knowing that, how can we mix them and still make a credible production? So we did a series of tests on that. And the first one was to determine critical focus for typical broadcast applications. So that's a bit small, but basically we took an interview setting. I'm not even using this one. I don't know why I'm leaning against it. If we look at a typical interview setting, so we're in a show where the camera is 32 feet away from my subject, so it's not right in their face. They have a cozy interview. On one side, I use a single large sensor. all of a sudden this is my depth of field. Well, if I have this much depth of field, then there's a reaction like, this is funny, or what do you think? All of a sudden my character is going out of focus. So you can focus full if you want, but this is really tough, first of all, and second of all, it's very distracting to the viewer. So in this kind of setting where things are unpredictable, a smaller sensor will give you this much depth of field. So I know I can have my interviewer in focus, can move around, be comfortable with the interviewee. They can have a good discussion and keep everything in focus. So looking at typical production values, the narrower you are, the worse you are for depth of field. That's because depth of field is linked to magnification, or how much you zoom in if you want. So close-up are very, very tight. And I remember early tests where they were trying to use single large sensor to do the evening news, and you had the eyes of the anchor in focus, and the tip of the nose and the back of the ears were out of focus. So that's very complicated when you would like the person to stay in focus, and for them it means that they really need not to move while they're doing everything and appear natural while being completely immobile. It's very hard. Medium shots are a bit more forgiving, but even for very wide shots, you don't have a lot of depth, and that becomes problematic in certain applications as we will look at. So that was our first series of tests for critical focus. One of the things we realized when we worked in two different television sets is we have a significant issue with aliasing with some of our on-set screens and displays. And this is what it looks like. Basically what happens here is the 2/3 sensor will not give you as much, and then you just switch the same shot to a large sensor, and all of a sudden all hell breaks loose on your screen. So with a bit of investigation, what we realized is that using a Bayer pattern is actually a checkerboard. So you apply a checkerboard pattern against a linear pattern from the LED on the screen. And when those two interfere, they create a lot of aliasing. So that's where the moire pattern gets accentuated by single large sensor just by the nature of the way it subsamples the image with the checkerboard pattern. There are ways that you can use to remediate this. So if I use an optical low-pass filter on my camera, I will get rid of it, but I will also get rid of anything nice and sharp in my image, which is not the goal. So instead of applying it to the camera, we apply it to the offending screens. So that's one thing that people working in cinema are not necessarily aware of. But in cinema, if you have a cave with an LED wall, the pitch is going to be incredibly small, and you're going to have a very, very high resolution on your screen. But the average screen in broadcast applications, if you're doing a show with a lot of musical numbers, you're going to have a wide array of LED panels, and these can be as wide as 2.5 millimeters between the pixels. So it's a fairly large pixel pitch, which works with 2/3 cameras, but doesn't work with single large sensor. So in that case here, what we did is we applied a diffusion filter on those LED panels, and that did the job. But it also reduces contrast. So that means that we now needed to do some additional video processing to boost the contrast before we reduce the contrast so that the color doesn't look too washed out when we present the image. So it added a bit of complexity to maintain the look. Another good tool is actually a rear projection screen. You could put a rear projection screen, put it just slightly above your LED wall, and that will also diffuse the pixels and reduce that high contrast between the checkerboard pattern of the single large sensor and the linear pattern of your RGB LED wall. We also checked to see if the cameras match, because if I have an intercut between a 2/3 sensor camera and a single large sensor and they don't look the same, we're not in business. So we used, it's not a publicity for them, but we used the Sony f5500, which was our single large sensor, and the Sony HDC 3500, which was our 2/3. And both models of cameras made by the same manufacturer in 709 came out to look the same, even though the imaging technology behind them is not the same. So that was advantageous to us. So we were able to intercut from one to the other without a noticeable visible difference. We didn't do it in HDR. That would be the next step, but at least in 709, they do match. What differs, though, you have the same body, same form factor, but a lot of the accessories are different. You cannot use the same back unit to just plug into your camera and use your inventory and just have a body for a single large, because you need to have the processing to debuyer in real time and give you your RGB image. So the back end of the camera is not the same for both. The controls on the CCU can be the same, but the back end is different. Also, since, like I said, a sensor that's this big versus a sensor that's this big, of course, scale exaggerated to enhance my discussion here. So that small sensor here needs a smaller lens than that sensor here, which needs a much longer lens and a much bigger lens, which means that typically where we have B4 mounts in broadcast, you need PL mounts in a single large sensor because the lens is too big and too heavy to be fitted with a normal bayonet type broadcast support. So cost considerations in there. So we took a whole week to do all of those tests with a quiz show, with a musical show, and with a kids show. And then we interviewed the different creatives and the artisans that were involved in the process. Contrary to what I thought, the fact that the depth of field is very narrow, I thought would be annoying for the camera operator who is also focus pulling at the same time as he or she is framing. But they kind of liked it because with a tree chip, your depth of field is so deep that you can be not exactly on it, but it still looks good. So it's kind of, I'm not really sure if I'm really at the focus plane or not because my image is still crisp. Where the single large sensor, you know it. You dial it in and you know you're in focus or you're out of focus because it is very tight. So they liked it. The director of photography loved it. They liked the way the light falls off the subject, storytelling capabilities of the single large sensor. But then again, if we have problems with the screens, it's not their problem. They just say, hey, technical guys, make it work. Creatives in general, they like the look of combining single large sensor for certain shots and 3-chip cameras for other shots, and intercutting between them is not a problem when you know how to tell your story. You're not going to intercut from a very wide, very deep focus into a very, very narrow focus shot, bang, like that. You're probably going to have some intermediary shot. So the technical director will learn the language of intercutting those cameras so that it makes sense, but from a viewer perspective, it works very nicely. There are some other things I've seen out there where it's not always the case, in a very large sporting event, let's say, where they were using single large sensor and it became very obvious because they were covering all the sports with 3-chip cameras and everything was in focus, and all of a sudden the person wins and you see the person and everything else is a super huge blurry mess. So there are ways to work your things around so it's not that obvious. But the language, I guess, is not yet universally adopted. Moire is a significant concern. If you're using a lot of screens in your set, you need to plan for budget to manage them properly. And it's the case for us when we're doing this, that we're using a lot of those LED panels, and not necessarily just a nice rectangle in the back, but all sorts of weird combinations of modules that give you a horizontal strip, a vertical strip, a cross, and all things like that. So you need to have budget to make sure that moire is not going to be an issue. So some conclusions from the project overall. It is possible, and that's what we demonstrate, to create a hybrid program with a combination of single large sensor and 3 chips. Hopefully getting cameras from the same manufacturer. I haven't tested if we can make color match between different manufacturers, but at least in that one case where we use one manufacturer, they all match, so that was nice, and we were able to use a combination. You need to plan for separate equipment. So from everything from the back end of the camera to the accessories, the lenses. So there is a bit of a difference in the mechanics. It's not just swapping a body. There's more to it than that. The technical crew really enjoyed working with it. The creatives loved it. They liked the creative freedom to all of a sudden isolate the subject from the background when appropriate. And a word of warning on the last point is due to the fact that you cannot get very deep focus with a large sensor and you have more issues. You need to understand those things, plan your production accordingly, and plan some time to go and test and validate your actual setting before you start to run a production like that. I'll briefly talk, since I have a lot of time. I speak too fast this afternoon. Some specific use cases, and this kind of correlates to what I've seen on the market. We'll see with our second presenter this afternoon if they see the same thing. For sports, that single large sensor will work if you have individual sports or sports where the people are in very close proximity. So I've seen it, for example, used effectively in boxing where the 2 boxers are just one against the other, so that worked. But if you have a field sport like soccer or football or hockey, it's incredibly difficult because you cannot keep everyone in focus, and it's kind of frustrating for the viewer to view the action and be limited in what they can resolve because everything else is out of focus. And you tell them, watch the ball there. Yeah, but I want to watch the defensive play behind, but I can't because it's out of focus. So sports really depends on the application. For galas and live music shows, it is usable. Galas is great for nomination if you want to isolate someone in particular in a crowd from the rest. Just be careful of the screens and the moire effects. So plan your budget accordingly to mitigate that issue. Either you get very, very small pixel pitch, which is very expensive, or you get diffusion that you can apply at the screen themselves to reduce the effect. And finally, what is game shows, quiz shows, unscripted reality shows? I do not personally recommend it, even though there are storytelling opportunities. The fact that people are moving in unpredictable fashion, they're not hitting a specific marker and staying immobile there, but there's really a lot of motion. It becomes very, very hard to tell your story effectively with single large sensors. I mean, in cinema, they have someone that's framing and they have someone that's fully focused. That's not the case in broadcast. Both operations are typically done by the same person. But even if you had a focus puller, it's a daunting job. Even if you put it in automatic focus, it becomes very distracting to the viewer because you keep shifting focus from one person to the other. So in those cases of environments, I would say, let's say traditional, use smaller sensors, get deep depth of field, and that way you can enjoy the show a lot more.